Welcome to Behavioral Groups, the podcast that explores our human condition. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We talk with researchers and other interesting people to unlock the mysteries of our human behavior by using a behavioral science lens.
Well, I talk to researchers and other interesting people. You, Tim, just get stuck on a plane or something.
Oh, so you're referring to the fact that I couldn't make this interview with our guest because of my travel schedule.
Maybe I am. Maybe I'm not.
Look, you know that I would have made it if it was even remotely possible. I was looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, and I'm sure the guest would have appreciated it too. Poor guy got stuck just talking with me. I mean, poor guy.
Not disagreeing.
No, you're supposed to disagree. Oh my God, Tim.
I'm just kidding. No, you did great. Honestly, man, after more than 370 episodes, you built up some skills.
Well, I learned from the best. I learned from you, Actually, in reality, I think that these conversations that when you're on, you bring a different perspective. You have a different point of view. And I think that's why we work so well together. I think that's good.
Yeah, well, that and the fact that we can make fun of each other, right? And we know that it's all in good fun.
Yeah, we are the click and clack of behavioral science, even though we're not brothers.
Do you think any of our listeners know who you're talking about when you say the click and clack of behavioral science?
Good question. I mean, we have some older listeners. I get that, but I wonder. So, all right, let's check this out.
What?
If you know, listeners, if you know who we're referencing when we say click and clack, let us know on social media, what that is, the reference, the first person who does that. I will give a brain shift journal to. How about that? All right. We'll
okay.
First person that gets out there on social media, hears this and can tell us who click and clack are and what that is, we'll give out a free brain shift journal.
Okay, enough with the impromptu discussion about us. Let's tell people about this episode, which I think you should probably do since you were the only one there.
Take that. I'll take that. All right. So our guest in this episode was Adam Mastroianni. Adam is a postdoctoral research scholar at Columbia Business School and is also the author of a great blog called Experimental History. I found Adam through a few provocative tweets he sent, which led me down this rabbit hole of reading a bunch of his back issues of his blog, Experimental History, and really being intrigued by his perspective.
Yeah, I remember when you called attention to this and you first reached out to Anna, and I'm really glad you did. Really glad you did.
Yeah, and I think we even had a discussion on our take on it, right? That we kind of had different perspectives on some of his blogs. Anyway, I thought we wanted to talk to him on the show about some of his perspectives, like the impact of fraudulent research on behavioral science and the limits of current psychological research and the need for a paradigm shift, or even the fact of, do you need to really floss?
Yeah. Oh, this is going to be good. Yeah, I really should have been a part of this.
You would have enjoyed it.
Yeah. Okay. So with that, listeners, we would like to urge you to grab your favorite glass of regret for not being in the room when it happened, along with me, because I'll be drinking the same thing, and enjoy Kurt's conversation with Adam Mastroianni.
Adam Mastroianni, welcome to Behavioral Groups.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I am happy to have you here. So for our listeners, Tim unfortunately had a travel incident and he can't make it. He's stuck in a plane somewhere. So I am doing this interview solo to probably Adam's remorse. He's probably going, oh my gosh, I wanted Tim. But anyway, we will start with the speed round, Adam, as we always do. First, really important question we need to ask you. Coffee or tea?
Neither.
Neither. Oh,
yeah. Caffeine makes me feel like a god, and then like I'm dying. I'm like weirdly sensitive to it. And I've had enough like mishaps where I drink some and I'm like, I feel awesome, and then 5 hours later I'm like, please kill me. And now my wife won't let me drink either of it unless it's like an emergency and I need to stay awake driving or something.
So you've realized over the course of the years that even that godlike feeling just doesn't outweigh the pain that comes at the end.
Yeah. It's so brief. And then later on, it's like, I feel terrible. Is it because things are terrible in my life? It must be that something's gone wrong. And then like a few hours later, I'll be normal again. I'm like, oh, it was just because I was coming down from caffeine.
It was just the caffeine, blowback.
Yes.
All right. Well, good.
Yes.
All right. Second speed round question. Would you rather have dinner with your favorite musician, actor, or athlete?
Oh, I think musician, although it would take me a while to figure out which one. I think because I would expect a musician to be more interesting in talking to about their craft than an actor or an athlete. That like being able to do a thing and being able to talk interestingly about the thing are two often orthogonal abilities. And I think a musician is more likely to have the second one than like an actor might be like, I show up and I read the lines they give me. I've been an actor as well, so I know about that. An athlete is like, I run fast. And I'm like, what's that like for you? And it's like, it hurts. Like, cool.
And the music, well, you would, again, Tim is going to be really bad that he's not here because he would be all over that with you for that. All right. Third speed round question, and this might get a little personal. Flossing, yes or no?
I'm a no. I'm a no on flossing. Not that I think it's bad, but I think the evidence is not there. And so if you do it, you're really taking it on faith and theory that it works. But if it did work really well, it seems like the most obvious intervention in the world. If it worked really well, the bad studies that we've done so far on it would have shown us that it at least does something. And even though the studies are bad and they're small and they're short, they don't really show anything. So we can at least rule out that it's a giant effect.
But your dentist told you. You wrote about this in a really great article. Your dentist actually, and your dentist partner called you up and talked to you about it.
It was the weirdest experience I've ever had. It's like, it's so difficult to like get a dentist on the phone. Like imagine actually talking to one, but one called me after hours, after I had told their colleague that are like, yeah, I've read the meta-analysis on flossing. There's not good evidence for it. And the another person in that office called me and was like, I know what you said, like accusing me. I know what you said about flossing. And he was like, I've seen the evidence, but in my professional opinion, if I had to choose between someone brushing or someone flossing, I would choose flossing. And I'm like, you're crazy. That office has since closed. And I don't know if it had anything to do with that. But there is actually good evidence for brushing with fluoride toothpaste. So.
Well, there you go. I have been doing both for a number of years, and I will just continue because it's part of my evening routine now, and I'm just so accustomed to it. Too much work to switch. All right. Here is the last speed round question. And again, speed round is a kind of a misnomer. It's never a speed round. But if I'm in a conversation with you, I pretty much know when I should stop talking, and we are both in agreement around that timing. Is that right? Am I right there?
Yeah, unfortunately, no. Unless we are the lucky 2% of pairs who in our study ended up saying after the conversation that it ended when I wanted it to, and the other person said the same thing. But 98% of people, for them, that didn't happen. So I fear the odds are against us.
Oh, man. So this was some recent research that you've done. Talk a little bit about what you guys were looking at, and then kind of the implications of what the findings of it are.
Yeah. This paper was called "Do Conversations End When People Want Them to?" And we had to fight with the journal to get them to allow us to use a question mark in the title, because it turns out that the answer is kind of complicated. It's like mainly no, but it's a lot more than that. And so we're interested in this problem that people face all the time, which is you're talking to someone and eventually that has to stop. You have to go do something else. But how do you do that? Because often it's offensive to say, I don't want to talk to you anymore. Goodbye. And we often conceal our desires from one another. And so how do people solve this? And one possibility was that like this problem works itself out, that like everybody comes to understand that like this is about the right time, and then they go home. So to find that out, we did two things. We both brought a bunch of people into the lab to have conversations, and then we surveyed them afterward. And we also surveyed a big sample of people online about the most recent conversation that they had. And in both cases, the results were the same, which is that very few people reported that the conversation that they just had ended when they first felt ready for it to end. A majority of those people said they would have wanted to leave sooner. Although on average, if you ask like, okay, how much sooner versus the people who said they wanted to continue, how much later, if you average that out, you get about 0, which is to say the people who wanted more wanted significantly more, and the people who wanted less, but less than the other people wanted more, if that makes sense. But
it does.
That's extra complicated because the people who wanted less, they're bounded at 0. So if we talk for 10 minutes, I can only say I wanted to go 10 minutes sooner. But if we talk for 10 minutes, I can say I want to go for an hour longer. So like it's hard to actually average those out. So a majority of people say, I want to go sooner. The people who want to go longer want to go meaningfully longer. But of course, they don't know what's going to happen, right? That's a prediction. That's not a report on their experience. And this happens for two reasons, as far as we can tell. One is that people very rarely want to speak for the same amount of time. So when we put people in the room, had to come out and say like, okay, you talked for about 25 minutes. Can you tell us when you first felt ready for that conversation to end? They tell us a time that is different from what the other person says. So already we've got a problem here that both people can't get what they want because they want different things. And then the second problem is that they don't know what the other person wants. So when we asked them, can you estimate when you think the other person first felt ready for the conversation to end? They were off by about half of the length of the conversation. So if I don't know what you want and we don't want the same things, it's very unlikely that we're both going to get what we want. I mean, that's impossible, but also unlikely that even one of us is going to get what we want.
Yeah. So next research study you should do is just podcasts and how long podcasts go and how long listeners really want it to go, because I'm sure we go way too long on many of ours, but that's a whole separate issue aside. So we'll hopefully not do that with this. So Adam, I wanted to just give our listeners a little bit of background. So Tim and I discovered you. We were following you on Twitter or X or whatever it was called these days. And you'd written this great post and it was from your blog. You have a blog called Experimental History. Did I get that right?
Yep.
And you had written about the recent fraud claims that kind of have rocked behavioral science, and specifically talking about those fraud claims against Dan Ariely and against Francesco Gino. And obviously that's been discussed a lot within this field. It has been kind of taken on its own life in a certain way. But what I found very interesting, and I think what I wanted to talk to you about today, is your take on how even if everything was made up in their work, if every study that Dan Ariely had done, every study that Francesca Gino had done, that in the big picture, it's this, it wouldn't really matter. And you kind of coined this, it's a wonderful life concept. If I never lived, how would the world change? And, if these, research studies had never been done, how would that have impacted that? Can you expand on that idea and explain what you were trying to say with that?
Yeah, I was trying to show that like what this scandal I think is better thought of as sort of like a celebrity scandal, like from the social angle rather than a scientific scandal. So like if it turns out that all of the allegations are true, which I have no idea if they are or not, which is important to say because now there's some lawsuits.
Because we don't want to be sued either. Here we go.
Exactly.
Yes.
But let's imagine that they all turn out to be true. What have we lost scientifically? And I don't like saying this, right? It's not something that I take pleasure in saying about another person's work, but I don't think we actually lose that much. In part because both of those researchers are working in a tradition that I think was really productive at the beginning when it started in the 70s, and I think now has sort of run its course. And now we are really squeezing the last drops out of it. And it is what some people call like the heuristics and biases tradition or judgment and decision making. Basically, the foundational idea being that humans are generally pretty good at navigating their lives. However, they rely on some ways of solving problems that you can engineer situations where those ways go haywire. And the cynical version of this, which is what a lot of people take away from this, is like, oh, people are really stupid and they make mistakes all the time.
Yeah.
And I have another piece called the radical idea that people aren't stupid, that like, I think that's the wrong take on this research. And even from the beginning, that's not what people were really trying to do, but other people have like taken that and run with it. But that insight has been really productive. We found a lot of ways that like, oh, if you ask questions in this one way versus this slightly different way, like people give really different answers. That's been really interesting for about 50 years.
Yeah.
And so like, that's great. I think we did some cool stuff. However, I don't think there's a lot of progress left to make there. And that is where both of those researchers are working. Now, in the case of Ariely, what he was really good at, and I mean, remains good at, he's still around, is popularizing that research and making it accessible and entertaining. And so if he never existed, you would lose that for sure. But in terms of the foundational scientific insights, like what we know now versus what we knew before, I don't think there's a lot there. And I think it goes to a deeper. Sorry, go ahead.
No, actually, that's where I was. Let's go to that deeper part, because I think that there's an underlying component within this that we have to think about the behavioral science world in general. And I'd love to kind of explore that more.
Yeah. So the optimistic take on this, or the positive take on this, is like, look, we've got a solid insight here that's been worked on for a long time from many different angles, from many different people. And it doesn't really matter what one person does, because that knowledge is distributed and embedded now. And I think that that's a good take. The other take on it is that we're kind of stuck in what I think of as a proto paradigm. So not a full-fledged scientific paradigm, like other fields have developed, where we have these set ways of doing things and we keep iterating in the same domain without actually pushing our understanding forward. So like I had this terrible realization a couple of years ago going to a conference where I was like, wait, everything that we're doing here is sort of just a take on all the things that I read about in my intro psych textbooks 10 years ago. Like, what has really changed? What have we really discovered like since I've been here? And so one of the points I make in that piece is like, I don't think we have a ton to show for ourselves in the past 30 years in terms of like the big fundamental insights, like nothing on the scale that like Kahneman and Tversky had back in the 70s. I think that was the last, to me, clear time, at least in social psychology, that there's like this clear inflection point, that things are different after that than they were before. People disagree with me on this, just to be clear. but I think if you look at the past, it's not great.
Right. Well, and you bring up, and I'm going to quote from one of your papers that you wrote, there's no world-changing insight like relativity, evolution, or DNA, nor any smaller but still very cool discoveries like polymerase chain reaction. I'm sure I just messed up pronouncing that. CRISPR or the Higgs boson. So when we think about this, and there is a component to that, right? You look back and you look at Kahneman, Tversky, you look at the groundbreaking work from the late 70s, early 80s that they were doing. And then you can go, we built slight changes off of that, which have had, in some instances, some pretty important impact. You look at, Save More Tomorrow and some of those programs, and there has been positive impact on the world and on individuals. But to that larger extent, where do we need to go as kind of a field? What should we be doing? Because I don't know if most researchers that are out there, and we can go back and talk about the science and how it works of, I'm adding this little bit to the literature and this little bit, and over the course of time that makes into a big impact or not. But where do you think we should be looking? What should we be doing? And I'll go back, because you wrote a paper about, trying to turn one big ship or, launching many small ships. And I don't know if that's where you want to take this, but go from there.
I think what we need to be doing is trying to turn psychology into a paradigmatic science.
Okay.
And
so what does that mean? Let's get that explained for the listeners out there. What does that mean?
A paradigm here being a useful way of organizing knowledge and acquiring new knowledge. So I think one of the best examples that we have is like the periodic table in chemistry, which is to say that like we realized in the middle of the 1800s that like if you order the elements that we've discovered in this certain way, they have certain regularities that are really interesting. And also there's gaps in, like, we're missing elements here. Like we've got a number 44 and we've got a number 46, but we don't have a number 45. We think if you went looking for it, you could find a number 45, and then people ended up doing that. part of what's interesting about the discovery of the periodic table is that they did this before they knew exactly what was ordering them. It was going to be another like 60 years before they discovered like the nucleus, and they knew that like we're ordering them based on the number of protons in the nucleus. So even without a complete understanding of how the system worked, they were able to organize their knowledge in such a way that they could go, there's regularities here and there's missing pieces here. And so that both organizes what we know already and organizes our future efforts. And now we're at the point where like it's really hard to do any kind of work without thinking in those terms. That turned out to be really useful. Another paradigmatic paradigm shift is like the movement from Aristotelian physics to modern physics. That like in Aristotle's view, the world is made of 4 different elements, I think, and they have their specific order, and motion is the movement of things back to where they're supposed to be. So air is supposed to be above water. So if you like take some water and put it under the air, it's going to rise up back through the water and be back where the air is. And there's a great piece that I read recently about how like if you think through it, it does make a lot of sense from the inside. It is consistent with a lot of things that you see in the world, but you can't show up in the world of physics today and go like, I used Aristotle's physics to like do, I used one of the 4 elements. It doesn't work anymore. It's like nonsense now. What we need in psychology is a point at which the things before become nonsense and the things after become sensical. A way of structuring the things that we know and organizing like the discovery of things that we don't know. It's difficult to talk about because it is like the acquisition of a new language.
Right.
But from the best that we can tell, and Thomas Kuhn wrote a lot about this. Obviously, this is where I'm getting a lot of this back in the 60s. That like this is actually how scientific disciplines make progress. That it is both through the acquisition of like each little brick in the edifice, but then you start finding bricks that don't fit anywhere, and you go, wait, we actually have to tear down the structure that we have now and build a new one that can accommodate these new bricks. And in so doing, you lose a lot of the bricks that you had already. And so it's not just the steady acquisition of additional facts. It's in fact the acquisition of additional errors that make the current paradigm untenable and that require a revolution and a new one. I think the issue that we have. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I can go on about this for a long time.
No, this is really interesting because again, this is one of those aspects of as we look at what behavioral science has brought and is continuing to bring. What I'm hearing you say is that we can go on this way and you'll get these small incremental pieces and they might have an impact here or there. But the larger and better way of maybe approaching this is looking at this with a different lens, is taking this and saying, how do we organize what we already know into a system like a periodic table that we can take and look at this to look at the larger impact and then find where the big gaps are and maybe go after those. If I summarize that in a manner that is appropriate.
Yeah. That if we keep doing what we're doing, it's not clear that we will continue to make progress. And part of the reason I suspect this is it's not clear that we've made a lot of progress recently doing what we're doing. And so I sometimes at conferences like pose this question to people, like in 50 years, what will be different? Like, what do you expect us to know that we don't know now? And people have a really hard time answering that question. Like, what will we have besides a stack of additional papers?
Yeah. Well, I'll go. So you also, in some of your things, so Paul Bloom, who's been a guest on our show a couple different times, you brought up a question that he had posed in one of his about, hey, what is, some of the cool research, I'm paraphrasing here, and kind of brought that up. And you and him then kind of had a back and forth, very cordial and very good. Yeah. But I think he might disagree on some of what you're saying here, saying that there have been some insights that we have that we can take and move forward. Am I paraphrasing that correctly?
Yes. Yeah. So Paul's point is, I mean, look at all the cool stuff that we've discovered.
Yeah.
And we argued about like, well, when did these discoveries actually happen? I was talking about the past 30 years. I think a lot of the things he talks about are like much earlier than that, or at least the beginning of those ideas. If we're going back to like the very beginning of experimental psychology, then like, have we ever done anything? I think, yes, we've done a lot. But I think we both agree that that's actually not the most interesting part of our disagreement. And my take anyway is that I think we are in agreement that like we will make progress when we discover a paradigm. And I think we might disagree on whether that will, or like the thing that we do need to do to make progress is to discover a paradigm. I think he might think, I don't want to speak for him, but my supposition is he might think that we can get there by doing more of what we're doing. And I think we can't get there by doing more of what we're doing, that we actually need to do something different. Yeah.
I'm going to paraphrase this really badly, but there's the old statement of, science moves forward when the old guard dies, kind of that piece of, and I don't think that's what you're necessarily saying here, but is there an element of that where, we still, you have 2 Nobel laureates that are still active and working in this field. You have numbers of people who have built entire careers around finding that next bias, that next piece. So do we have to kind of bring up this new generation of people who are saying, all right, I don't want to find the 310th bias that we know. I want to be able to put this into, as you say, a paradigm or find something larger to that degree. Is that part of this process, or is that not necessary?
I wish that we could solve this problem just by waiting for the funerals to come, as macabre as that would be. But I don't think this is actually a case of there's a younger generation that's agitating for something better, and there's an older generation saying that like, no, we need to keep it the way it is. It's not like every old person is like, the moon is made of cheese, and all the young people are like, I think it's made of rocks, and like they can't get their papers published. I actually think the thing that is stifling this progress is the intense competition for scarce resources that it is so difficult to get a job. It's difficult to publish papers. It's difficult to get ahead. And it's especially difficult if you want to try to do any of those things while doing stuff that's going to look weird, because revolutionary science always looks weird. And so our main institutions of doing science are really optimized for what Thomas Kuhn would have called normal science. That like, everything's great, guys, keep doing what you're doing. It's like the moment when we have the periodic table and we need to fill in the blanks. I think that is what we're optimized for. But if it ever came to pass we needed to overturn the periodic table, it'd be really bad at doing that. Not so much because the old people have too much power. I think the young people have too little courage. And that, the structures are against them, that people don't want to hire someone who's going to do things that aren't legible to them and that aren't going to increase their H index and, and improve the numbers of the institution. I think that's really what you need if you want to do something revolutionary.
Well, and you get to a point where you're talking about some of the incentives that we have of how people get rewarded and recognized, how you gain tenure, how institutions gain, research grants and prestige and get, top people coming in. And so all of those are structured on a way, and going back, not that we need to go back to this, but it goes back to some of the issues that I have around when we talked about Ariely and Francesca Gino, and like, so why did this happen at the underlying root cause of this, as opposed to, the specifics. It's like, we're set up for a system that is looking for the novel, that rewards that unique idea that kind of stands out, but isn't so far out there that it's too crazy. And so all of that taken into account, I think, what I'm hearing you say is it's not this war of the old guard against the new guard. It's just, it needs to be a shift in our mindset in how we think about this, and that needs to happen. It can happen, might be happening with some of the old guard right now. And it's the institutions and kind of how the world is structured that it's just, you're running into friction points that it makes it harder to make that change.
Yeah. And a lot of people think of this in terms of, we've got bad incentives. We need to change the incentives. I don't disagree with that. And I'm certainly support anyone who wants to work inside the system to make the incentives better. But I think actually there's a lot more to be gained in diversifying the incentives. That this system is optimized for producing a certain kind of science. And And we need that kind of science. We do need people to do normal science. And in fact, I think we need an ecosystem of people doing science in different ways. And I'm happy for this to be one of the ways that, people publish papers in peer-reviewed journals. If that's the way that they like to do it, if that's the way they think they do their best work, I have no interest in stopping them. What I have an interest in starting is a lot of people doing things in different ways, and actually in recapturing some of the diversity that we used to have in the way that people approached science and communicated it. So I'm reading right now a history of the Royal Society, which is sort of like the first professional society of scientists. They weren't even called that then, but in the early 1600s in the UK. And I mean, the first meetings are basically show and tell. It's people doing weird stuff. They're like, I found a weird calf. Look, it's got a bulbous head. And like, look, I've got these like glass beads and they like rise in water. What's up with that? And there wasn't a lot of standardization in the approaches that people were taking. And this was famously a pretty fertile time for science. That next 100 years of people basically screwing around, doing things that they thought were cool, got us a lot of the fundamental insights that we still work with today. And we don't really have that anymore. There's not a lot of screwing around, because if you screw around, you fall out of the pipeline. And so that's what I would love to see more, a bigger ecosystem that can support more people doing weirder things.
Yeah. Adam, on that, and I don't know if this is part of what you're thinking of, but when you talk about the Royal Society, and the way that I envision it is that it's people coming from a whole lot of different backgrounds as well. And I think when we look at the world, academic world, research world of today, we don't mix those different disciplines as much as I think happened maybe in the past. We don't, there are some, I mean, I know Carnegie Mellon has their decision science where they have, rocket scientists and other people in that same, department. But for most organizations, you're in psychology, and you're in experimental psychology, or you're in counseling, or you're in social psychology, and they don't even cross over that much. And so that diversity of thought and idea, is that some of this weird kind of science that you're talking about, being able to maybe mix some of the physical sciences with some of the, social sciences, other pieces along that line?
Yeah, one big advantage the Royal Society had is exactly this, that you can have people coming in who do meteorology, and other people do geology, and other people are physicians, and other people are thinking about heredity. And some of those are actually the same person doing all of those things. What they didn't have in terms of background is, everybody in that room obviously was a white British guy with usually of independent means.
Yeah.
And so that is a way in which they had a lot less diversity, that we beat them on that now, but they beat us dramatically in terms of the diversity of approaches that people had. And I think the diversity of attitudes that people had toward science. I mean, Lavoisier, one of the pioneers of microbiology and the microscope, he made his money as a draper, selling drapes. And this was what he did. This is really what he loved to do. And he would, in the words, I think of the Royal Society itself, would send unhinged, chaotic letters to the Royal Society about the things that he was doing. We don't have, I think, enough of drapers who are sending unhinged letters. That is what I'd love if there to be more of. And I'd love if they weren't all just white guys, obviously.
Yeah.
And that's a problem that we've been working on a lot, which is good. But I think we have lost this dimension of diversity, which is people doing weirder things. And yeah, one of the weird things you could do is not have to be just a specialist in one field. I think this is an illusion that has developed over the past couple generations, that that's the only way that you could make progress in a field, is you have to specialize, because there's so much to know. I think this is actually has a lot more to do with the social reality that we're dealing with, that in order to be recognized by the geologists, you have to be very steeped in what the geologists are doing. But that doesn't mean that you need to do that in order to make progress in geology. In fact, you may be better off not being steeped in their assumptions and in their ways of doing things, because you might find an insight that they couldn't find. I certainly feel this way in psychology. I think one of the most insightful books about psychology was written by an electrical engineer who like thought about it very differently and learned a lot about, the things that the psychologists and the neuropsychologists had figured out about brain lesion studies and whatever. He wasn't just spouting off, but he was bringing a very different perspective and expertise to the topic. And I think if you tried to do that today, I think if you were an electrical engineer who's like, hey, psychologist, I got something to say to you, they would go like, well, you have to spend 30 years becoming one of us before you can be one of us. And I think we would lose out. We are losing out.
Okay. I need to get the name of that book and we'll put it in the show notes. So if you don't have it on top of your head, we'll email later. But if you do, and then secondly, so I brought this up earlier but you had this article and you talked about this idea of moving, this big ship and changing its course or launching hundreds of little ships. And that metaphor, that analogy, I forget which one it is, just stuck with me. And can you talk about that? Because you were arguing that instead of trying to turn this big ship, we just need to have a lot more ships out there. Is that what we've been talking about here? Or is it something different? How do you talk about that?
Yeah, it's exactly what we've been talking about here. Just in this terms of right now, if you want to do basic research, you are probably on one big ship called academia. And that ship is gigantic. There's a lot of money in it. There's a lot of people in it. And if you want to change its direction, it's really difficult because you got to convince everybody to turn a certain way and everybody disagrees about which way it should go. I don't have any problem with that ship existing or even with it being big. I just don't want it to be the only ship because big ships have their advantages. They can move a lot of people, right? You have like gains in scale of everybody being together, doing the same thing and organizing, and there's HR or whatever, but they turn really slowly. And science is about exploring the space of possibilities, and you explore a lot faster when you have many smaller things going in many different directions, because whenever they discover something true, they can report back to the other ships, and now everybody benefits from it. So we don't all need to be on the same ship, going in the same direction, trying to all discover things together. There can be people going off and doing their own things and figuring something out that we wouldn't have figured out going in the direction that we are going in. And so what a lot of people want to do when they want to reform academia is turn the big ship, which is fine. I think it could go in a better direction, but I think there's a lot more to be gained in launching little ships that can do things totally differently.
Yeah. Again, in my head, I'm loving that vision. I'm sitting here going, oh, have the big ship, but you can have a bunch of little ships that have come other places, or you can even have, the boats off of that big ship. You might have been on that big ship for a long time, and now you want to take that little boat and go explore those little islands over there that the big ship can't go to. Yeah. Anyway, I love the analogy. Love the piece that we were talking about there. All right, I want to bring up one other, again, for listeners, I implore you, go out and sign up for, is it a blog? Is it a newsletter, Experimental History? Is it?
Yeah, what is it? It defies definition. It is all of those things.
It's fantastic. Anyway, it is really fantastic. Every time I read one of your articles, I get really excited because it brings up, you have a perspective that I love, that I think is really interesting. And one of those is that you had talked in one of the articles about is that scientific certainty is something that is not really available, right? And you bring it up in a really interesting manner. I don't know if you want to share kind of how you start that piece.
Yeah, this is a piece I wrote for the New York Times that I wanted to title, I'm so sorry, but you don't get to know the truth right now. And I guess in like the massive A/B testing that they do when they put articles out, I guess the search for scientific certainty is futile. It like won. But a lot of people don't know this when you write. This is part of why I write a blog where I get to pick these things. But when you write for a major outlet, they get to pick the title. Yeah. And then people are like, why did you call it that? And I'm like, I didn't. But
some editor did. That was back there. Yes. They ran, as you said, number of A/B tests on their panel. Yes. And they're like, oh, this is the one.
But the piece begins with the fact that I don't floss. And I've felt shame my whole life every time I go into the dentist, because there's a point where they go, do you floss? And first of all, I go like, shouldn't you be able to tell looking at my teeth whether I floss or not? If it's so good, wouldn't you be able to know? Like, you would know whether I exercise by looking at my muscles. You would know whether I bathe by smelling me. Why can't you know whether I floss by looking at my teeth? But hey, that's beside the point. And then I found a meta-analysis by this group called the Cochrane Collaboration, who what they do is they do these big meta-analyses. They pull together all these studies. They do work that I think is both extremely important and very boring to actually do, right? And so good on them for doing that. And so they pulled together any of the experimental studies that have been done on flossing on whatever dental outcomes, and found first the evidence is really bad in that the studies are not good. They're at high risk of bias with like their assessment tool because they're small, or they don't have good randomization procedures or whatever. There's this whole checklist that they go through of rating the risk of bias of the study. So the studies aren't good, but to the extent that they have any results at all, the results are not obviously in favor of flossing. They don't find evidence that it hurts, but they really don't find much evidence at all that it helps. And they haven't even looked at things like, does flossing impact the number of cavities that you get? And so that's all fine. It's fine not to know, but it is not fine to act like you know when you don't. And so the fact that flossing is universally recommended and enforced by shame in dentist's office toward innocents like me, I think is a real misstep. And so the point that I make in the piece is I would so much have rather had a conversation with my dentist where they were like, look, nobody's done a good study on this, so we can't say for sure whether it works or not. However, it should work because of this way that we think dental health works and plaque and whatever. In my experience, I think it works, and that's why I encourage you to do it. And I might have gone like, okay, well, maybe that's good enough for me, or maybe it's not good enough for me. But what I didn't want was to be lied to and to be shamed for not doing something that we don't have the certainty to make this a universal recommendation. If it's so obviously good, it should be very easy to discover that effect, even in these bad studies. And in the piece, I go into other things as well. Yeah.
Well, that's the piece, right? I mean, you use this as an example, but it goes to the larger piece where, and I think some of this, and again, correct me if I'm making too big a leap, which I think is what we're often talking about here, is that when, there is a study that is done, and I'll bring up another piece that you wrote here, but if there's a study that's done and then you go, oh, well, that's the truth. And so universally, this should work. Like talking to strangers is a really good thing. And, both people are happy at the end of that. And so maybe I should go and join, an escape room and be the stranger in a party.
Yeah.
And yet that doesn't necessarily work out all the time. And again, I'm sorry, I'm bringing this in for people who don't know. You wrote a wonderful article about, that experience. We can talk about that too. But more generally, is it this idea of that we tend to overgeneralize or say this is a study, and I think it was Roy Baumeister or Max Bazerman, I can't remember which of the two that we talked about when they were talking about the replication crisis. What they were saying is, again, if there wasn't fraud, if there wasn't anything going on here, what we can always say is we go, look, in this situation, in this time, with this group of people, this was the result that we found. Now, if you generalize that out, which is what science is supposed to do, that's great, but it doesn't always happen that way. And that's where I was going when I read what you were saying. Am I way off base?
No, I think that's part of it. So yeah, what we often do in the social sciences is we create a story. And I don't mean a story in the sense of like, we do storytelling to sell our results, although we also do that. But when you put people in a situation and they like take actions and a result occurs, like that's a story. That is what that unit of information is. Stories are really powerful because we remember them better. They're a useful way of organizing knowledge. However, they're easily overgeneralizable. And what a story really shows you is that a thing is possible because a thing happened. Mm-hmm. This is, I think, often what studies are actually showing is that a thing is possible. And it just turns out that in most cases, there's not a good reason to suspect that the thing was not possible before it happened, which is why some of our most legendary studies are the ones in which there was good reason to think that a thing wasn't possible before it happened. I think the Milgram studies are an example of this. Yeah. That, and I mean, he, I think very cannily actually got people to go on record saying that they didn't think that people were going to shock, a stranger to death in the laboratory. And then he shows that they did, or at least they think that they're doing that. These have been criticized a lot lot, by the way. And I think actually this is a case in which the criticisms don't hold up, that I think the main findings from those studies, I think, are still sound, even having read some of the critiques. But I think the reason why those studies are so important is because we did not think beforehand that could happen.
Yeah.
And now we know that it can happen. That doesn't mean that it does happen all the time. That doesn't mean that like this is a good explanation for all kinds of different things. But it falsifies a really strong and reasonable null hypothesis. That's why I think it's a great study.
So again, when I was reading this, it brought up to my mind. All right, so paradox of choice, this idea that, hey, more choice, we like that, we prefer that. Economists would say that, yes, we always need more choice. And there was some really great research that showed, well, that doesn't necessarily always hold true. And so now it's kind of become the story, as you talk about, well, we need to limit choices in order to get better outcomes in various different things. And Rory Sutherland had this great insight. He said, and I think you bring up this idea of context. And Rory Sutherland said, that works great. But if I'm going, and the study was originally done with jams in a supermarket, right? You had 36 jams that were on a table versus 6, and you got a coupon, and how many people actually bought the jams afterwards. And you limited the number, and you had more people actually buying those jams. But he said, that's great if I'm going into a supermarket, right? And I have all these other things that I'm trying to buy. But he goes, if I go to a store called the World of Jams, right? And I am there to kind of explore jams. I don't want 6 jams. I want hundreds and hundreds of jams. Mm-hmm. And so this idea of limiting choice in that context doesn't make sense. And yet we tend to over kind of index on that. And therefore that's part of, as you're saying, we can't just take this one study and then apply it across every domain in every situation. So, yeah. Anyway, not a question there, but just kind of my own statement on that. I know we are getting near the end, and if Tim was here, he'd want to talk about music. But I do have to just ask, what's it like to ruin birthday parties? Because I teed this up earlier, but what tell that story.
It's terrible at the time, but it makes for a good story later. So I was in Atlanta like 5 years ago for a conference. And I stayed there an extra day because I thought a friend of mine was going to be in town and wasn't. And I'm really into escape rooms. And at the time, I was also hopped up on all this research about the unforeseen benefits of talking to strangers. And I thought, why not put these things together and sign up for escape rooms where I can see online that this used to be easier. They've tamped down on this a little bit for good reason, where I could see like, oh, there's like 5 out of 8 slots taken. I'll be number 6.
Yeah.
And I signed up for 2 of them. And I showed up, and it was immediately clear that I was making this worse for everybody. Because like the first one was like a birthday party. And it was like, there's some 30-something like, oh, we never get together. Like, let's get a babysitter and I'll like go to an escape room. And then I'm there and I'm like, hey, I like escape rooms, guys. Like, and quickly I was like, my flight was canceled and that's why I'm here. And they were really polite about it, but it was not the right place to be making friends. And then I stupidly went to the second one too. I'd already paid like the $35. So what was I going to do? Sunk cost. Famously, you're supposed to you're supposed to honor them. And so I realized that like, while it may be true that you can create situations in which people say like, it's not going to be good to talk to this new person, and then they're wrong. That's not always the case. That it requires the addition of some wisdom and some mental elbow grease to figure out like where that is true for you and where it's not going to be. So this is another case where it is useful to falsify this null hypothesis that people seem to have, that like talking to strangers is always bad. They're wrong about that. Sometimes it's much better than they expect. Right. That doesn't mean that it's always going to be much better than they expect. It doesn't even necessarily mean on average it's going to be better than they expect, although it seems pretty easy to find that effect. So it seems pretty prevalent to me.
Yeah.
And I would believe that like in general, we're probably a little too hesitant, but that doesn't mean that we're crazy. And so when I describe what I did to people and they're like, I would never do that. I'm like, you're 100% right. You're totally right. You should not do this.
Well, and I still, I've read the same research, and I know I should, when I fly, I should talk to that person next to me, but nope, I still don't. It's like, I'm just not there yet. And I think for me, at least, that context doesn't matter. All right. Kind of making sure that Tim doesn't, strangle me later today when we get together. I need to ask some musical questions. So
sure.
Very first one, Baz Luhrmann, everybody's free to wear sunscreen. Do you think that was the best graduation speech ever turned into a song?
I would love that when I was a kid, like downloading music on LimeWire, when I was like 12, and I found that I was like, this is cool. But now I think it dramatically overstates the benefits of sunscreen, which, at least the evidence for the benefits of sunscreen. Sunscreen may be great. The jury's still out. The meta-analyses don't show any effect on skin cancer, although maybe that'll ultimately be wrong. We'll see.
We'll see.
But certainly back in like 94 or whenever then that came out, we were not at that point then, even then.
Anyway, sorry. I know, again, I'm referencing a whole bunch of your papers. And again, I implore our listeners to go out and read, because they're just, A, they're insightful, but B, they're funny as well. And they bring a smile to your face. On a more, as the typical question that Tim might ask you is this: if you were on a deserted island for a year, just very comfortable, right? Everything is there for you. You're not having to be the, forage for food and find all that other stuff. But you had only an iPod for entertainment. And on that iPod was only 2 artists' works, their entire catalog of music. Which 2 artists would you want on that iPod?
One would be They Might Be Giants,
who
kind of turned me weird. They irradiated me when I was a kid in the middle of nowhere in Ohio and didn't have access to a lot of culture, and discovered them. And it was like, oh, you can make music like this. And their repertoire is very deep and very varied. And so I think I could spend a lot of time with them. As another artist, I might go with the Talking Heads. They might be too similar to.
I was going to say they have a very, very similar vibe.
Yeah. I'm probably going to end up going insane on this desert island. The problem is I don't listen deeply enough into people's repertoires. I find singles that I like, and I listen to them hundreds of times until I despise them, and then I move on to the next single. I'm like a succubus of music.
But Adam, then you need to have that deep catalog, right? Because you can, you can do that. So, They Might Be Giants, pretty big catalog. I think Talking Heads, probably a pretty big catalog as well. Yeah. So granted, it's very similar in sound. They Might Be Giants has some very different sounds, though. They're very different. What a Birdhouse in, I forget
Birdhouse in Your Soul.
One of my all-time favorite songs. So it's just, amazing. So, Adam, thank you. This has been very insightful, great work, and just a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for being a guest on Behavioral Grooves.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I share ideas on what we learned from my discussion with Adam, have a free-flowing conversation, and groove on whatever else comes into my informed brain.
No, I got to listen to the conversation too.
But I was there. I was in the room.
Okay, so that just means you had more control. That doesn't mean it was better.
No, it was a really good conversation, as you guys heard. I mean, the energy I thought was good. I thought there was lots of really great insights and great kind of perspectives. And not that I agree with all of them, not that I think everybody should agree with them, but I think you would have loved to have been part of that,
Would have loved it. So many things to talk about. And can we just start with the idea that Adam really is a big thinker. Yeah. He has this unique perspective. All of us have unique perspectives, but there is something that is differentiated in this big perspective view that he has, especially arcing through history. And I found that fascinating when listening to your conversation.
Well, this idea, right? And I know that you pointed this out in our conversation, this about, drapers from the 16th century, scientists.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just cool. It's not just novel. It's not just cool, but it combines this aspect of being a really important insight to go, that could get us thinking differently about the way we look at science today. And that's the bridge that he makes so beautifully.
Well, and I think it's really interesting because you and I are both practitioners. We are not working in academia. We're not necessarily doing research and research papers and publishing. I mean, I had to do that for my dissertation, but that's the last time I did anything like that. But we are bringing a different perspective and applying. And I think we could probably contribute to the literature, contribute to the research because we're in the field, we're in the mess, we're in the goo, as they like to say.
Well, two things about that. One is in my academic partnerships, in partnering with researchers from a variety of different universities around the world, I always respect the researchers, and all of them do this, by the way, this isn't just some, but they say, so what do you think? Okay, we're going to do a project. Here's the client's issue. Here's the database of people that we're working with. Here's the problem that we're trying to understand. What do you think? And then they, those academics have a respect for from my perspective as being a professional in the field, my observations.
Yeah.
And the second thing so I'm grateful for that. And the second thing I want to say is that I was just at a conference this week in Atlanta. And somebody was who is an author of kind of a non-science pop, psychology book, which is, and it's a good book, by the way. He says to me, so I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, and when you introduced yourself to me yesterday, Tim, you said that you were in behavioral science, but I see that your first job in behavioral science was just last year, in a really dismissive way. I'm like, dude. We don't have to have a job title to be of behavioral science, to be a practitioner of behavioral science.
Oh my gosh, that is just interesting when you put it that way. That just blows my mind because behavioral science, and we've talked about this, behavioral science is this idea of, identifying why we do what we do, and we talk about this. We're all accidental behavioral scientists. We all study this all the time. And you're not even accidental. So it wasn't in your title. But man, that's exactly what you've been doing for the past 20 plus years.
Yeah.
And I would have been.
Well, and I think that this is part of Adam's story, right? That we as practitioners have something to say.
And that's
in the scientific community.
And this idea that if you're thinking like this person in this Atlanta conference and going, oh, you don't have the background or the credentials or the you didn't go to this university to study this, therefore what can you bring to this conversation is wrong, right? That's what Adam is saying that we can be a draper and a behavioral scientist and an astronomer. Can I even say that word? But that, I think, is really important as we think through we as a field are going and just science in general. I think that's even a bigger perspective beyond the behavioral science world into any kind of science world.
Yeah.
And you could even take that. I'm making a big leap here. You could take that into business. You could take that into nonprofit kind of pieces. This idea of getting different perspectives, having a different viewpoint is really important because you do get a different view of the world from your history, your background, various different pieces that can shine a different light onto things that you may not see because you have blinders on because of what you've been through. So F that guy in Atlanta and damn it, we're going forward with stuff. So
I want to know what your experience was like when you started talking about the Dan Ariely and Francesca Gino fraud issues with Adam.
Yeah. So this is interesting. And Adam has a very unique perspective on this. And prior to getting onto this, we talked about this, but this idea that we took all of Dan's work, all of Francesca's work, and we found out that it was all fraud. and we removed it from the literature. We did It's a Wonderful Life, and they were never here, right? Boom. From the scientific part, the literature, actual literature part, what Adam is saying is how big of a difference would that make in the overall scheme of the science? And his argument is not that much.
Yeah.
And I think there's something to be said about that we have thousands of people doing research in these areas, that we have practitioners like you and me, many more thousands who are doing, application of this. And the idea that by removing the 50, 100 papers that they have worked on or did that, is that going to actually change what the knowledge base that we have? And he's saying maybe a little, maybe a bit, but you might have a different perspective.
I do. And I'm not going to belabor it, but I would just say that I'm not sure that I'm comfortable agreeing with that, because I can imagine counter evidence to that. And by saying that, and maybe it's not so much just the literature, but if we just take Sign at the Top, the article that was published that was retracted because of fraudulent data, that ironically Dan and Francesca worked on together, but also Max Bazerman and Anita Majar also worked on. There were several studies in that, but if Sign at the Top was evidentially sort of authorized and appropriate, and it was shown to actually work, and then it worked in the real world, there could be hundreds of millions of dollars of savings for insurance companies by moving the signature block from the bottom to the top. Now, it turns out that it's not, but there were definitely companies that tried it that got no effect.
But what I think Adam is saying here is that, look, Francesca and Dan were 2 of 4 authors on that one paper, and there were 2 other studies that were done that were around that. There was many other studies that looked at similar types of things around fraud and how you can go about them. And so that research wasn't just because of them. That research was there in addition to them. And so by taking their part of it out, does it actually change the research?
It's a fair question. I'm not sure that I'm willing to say yes.
Yeah. That
it does change, or no, that it doesn't change.
I think it is a different perspective, though, and it's one that gives me because you and I have talked about this. The fraud scandals have really rocked our world to a certain degree. There's an element of them that is just so disheartening.
Yes.
So just kind of just brings me angst that I am really. This kind of gave me a glimmer of hope, and I know that's
I can see why, and I agree with that there is something hopeful about that. To get back to Adam's perspective, I like the fact that he is looking for big paradigm shifts.
Yeah.
That what interests him is like the work of Kahneman and Tversky in 40 years ago that really changes things like that. And I agree that is cool, and that we should be striving and searching for the next Kahneman and Tversky,
right?
The next prospect theory
to build that new big ship.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, the conversation about big ship versus hundreds of little ships, right? Well, maybe that's not the best analogy, because I think with what, some of those little ships grow. They become larger ships because of the value that they find.
Right.
And then what you're saying is that there's value in that. There's value in growing little ships into bigger ships. And that means finding those little pieces of information that are on the edge. I'm not groundbreaking changing this, but I'm adding another piece to the ship, and this ship is getting bigger, and this ship is growing, and different pieces of it. So it does become a big ship. And I think there is value in that. I do like his perspective of saying, if that's all we're doing, then that's not a good thing. And I don't necessarily think it is. I don't think that's what many of the scientists out there. I think some of them to get published are saying, hey, we have to, add our piece to the big ship because it's easier. The incentives around this, the way that, they get promoted and other pieces are there. But I think many of them are actually, putting that dinghy out and rowing across the waves to look at that little atoll or island over there that says, hey, this could be cool.
Did you feel like Adam is basically saying, well, let's just wait for the old guard to die off?
No, he wasn't. I thought that's where I thought it was going. And he said, no. Yeah. That's not it. And I thought that was also another interesting piece. He said, I don't think it's the old guard. I think it's just the way that the system is structured in this. And we just, and we've talked about this before too. How do we change the structure? How do we change the way that research gets rewarded and that academics get promoted and tenure and all of the other facts of that? But in addition to that, I think, with this piece in particular, there is this aspect of saying, hey, we just need to find a new way of looking at this. And it doesn't matter if you're old guard or new guard, it's just finding that new way.
In some ways, I took his conversation with you to really represent a very progress-oriented perspective. Like, it's not throwing off the old guard, but it's definitely looking forward and looking for the next paradigm shift. And I kind of love that. And it struck me as being like this perfect antithesis of G.K. Chesterton.
Who is G.K. Chesterton? Because you just lost me.
Chesterton was early 20th century philosopher and defender of Christianity, British guy, fantastic writer, brilliant. He was sort of like a Rory Sutherland for the 1920s, not the 2020s. But Chesterton believed that tradition was a really good thing, but it's basically, he called it the democracy of the dead. That we're giving a lot of weight to people who have come before us in tradition. And and Chesterton believed that was a good idea. And to some degree, I felt like Adam was kind of saying, let's not give too much weight to what's been done, because, Aristotelian physics worked great for a long time. Newtonian physics worked for a long time, and we're in a new era. We have a new way of thinking about things. So let's keep moving. And I completely endorse that.
What was the Chesterton quote that you said?
Chesterton said, I'll give you the whole quote because I find it so interesting. Chesterton says, tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. In other words, if you're alive and, we're giving more credit, we're biased towards the newest ideas. And Chesterton was, not in favor of that. So,
yeah, it's interesting because there's an aspect of it where I don't disagree with Chesterton, but then there's another aspect of it where I go, no, we don't have to be beholden just because these people said this and did this, and this is the way that things have always been done. Yeah. And I think you started this off with this idea that is it just dying off? And I think the big piece of this is, we had that conversation, or I had that conversation with Adam about periodic table and kind of identifying behavioral sciences periodic table, but also this idea that, it's not about the old people having too much power. It's about the young people not having enough courage. And that cool. I think is really interesting. So
yeah, that was a great comment.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I think the last piece that I'd like to talk to is just, if we think about science, and we've touched on this already, is just the incentives are misaligned in academia, in my perspective, that the way that academic gets promoted, gets a tenure, gets a reputation, and can do this actually is counter to really being able to necessarily do good science. And I think we need to change that.
I want to say we need more drapers studying drapes and sharing their observations. That's, and I'm being a slightly hyperbolic, but I'm an advocate for Adam's idea of let's get more boats in the water.
Yeah.
And let's have them.
But drapers, not just studying drapes, but then looking at the stars and bringing in that, or understanding
that's true
why people like purple drapes over orange drapes versus other things, and bringing that knowledge into the fold.
All that, yes,
yeah. And Tim, do you floss your teeth?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
And I figured I should have known that you're going to bring this up. Yeah, because you are a ritualistic flosser.
I am a ritualistic flosser, but he brings
You're
up.
a believer.
I am a believer, and it was kind of like there was a physical response when he said that, and I found it fascinating because the actual piece that he talked about, this idea that the meta-analysis doesn't show a big difference. And even though there's not really good research behind it, if it was really powerful, you would have that. And by changing your behavior based on the science, which is something that I always advocate.
Mm-hmm. Are you ready to change your behavior?
I'm not feeling like I am going to advocate for that. And there's something about that.
Because
and it just
you believe in it.
It makes me think, But I love that concept. I love the concept of saying sometimes science and this idea of, the other piece that we talked about talking with strangers, and the him going into these escape rooms and being with strangers because the research says, that's a good thing, when in fact, in that situation and in that context, it wasn't. And so
bad.
We tend, this is my piece on this. I think conflating the two is sometimes the research is the research, and and we tend to generalize it more than we should.
I think every good scientist would agree that we are collectively bad at overgeneralization.
And we need to take it with a grain of salt and apply it in our own lives judiciously. And everybody keep flossing. That's what I'm going to say. Keep flossing.
Okay, let's wrap it up on that.
And with that, folks, we hope you have enjoyed this conversation that I had with Adam, and Tim was, conveniently away doing whatever he was doing. But that with it, you learn something that you can take with you and find your groove this week.